Module 2, Fractions and Decimals. This is Section 212, Fractions, Decimals, and Order of Operations. In this video, we'll look at how to change a fraction to a decimal, finding equivalent fractions so that we can change them to decimals in order to compare multiple sets of decimals, in order of operations, and simplifying expressions. To write a fraction as a decimal, you simply divide the numerator by the denominator. In your calculator, you would type 3 divided by a 4, and it would give you the 0.75. If you don't have a calculator, the denominator will come on the outside, and the numerator will go inside of the divisor. You would add a decimal point and a 0 so that you can begin your division. 4 doesn't go into 3, but it does go into 30. 4 goes into 30 7 times. 7 times 4 is 28. Subtract, and you're left over with 2. Add another decimal and bring down that decimal. Now we'll look at 4 into 20. That's 5 times. 4 times 5 is 20, so I have no remainder, and I don't need to add on another decimal. The quotient is 0.75. You would do the same thing for 2/5. You can type in 2 divided by 5, or you can say 5 goes into 2 how many times. It doesn't go into 2, but if I add in a decimal point and a 0, it does go into 20. 5 goes into 20 4 times without a remainder, so I don't need to add on any extra zeros. If you have a mixed number, you'll leave the mixed number part, the whole number part alone, and then you'll just change the fractional part into a fraction. I can type in my calculator 3 divided by 16, or if I don't have a calculator, I can say 16 goes into 3 how many times. It doesn't go into 3, so I'll need to add in my decimal point and add on a 0. 16 goes into 30 only one time. When you subtract, you get 14. I need to add on a 0 and then bring that 0 down. 16 goes into 140 8 times. 8 times 6 is 48. Carry the 4 and you have 12. Subtract and you get another 12. Add another 0. Bring that down. 16 goes into 120 7 times. 7 times 6 is 42. Carry the 4 and I have an 11. Finally, I'm left with an 8. When I add on one more 0 and bring that down, 16 goes into 80 5 times. And 16 times 5 is 80, and I'm finally done. 0.1875 is the decimal that represents 3/16. So if I want to say 3 and 3/16, I can take out the 3/16 and then piece on the 1.875. So 3 and 3/16 as a decimal is 3 and 1,875 10,000ths. Sometimes you might want to find an equivalent fraction. So 2/5, I can change this denominator to a 10 by multiplying the bottom by a 2. I would need to do the same thing up top, since and whatever you do to the bottom in fractions, you also need to do to the numerator. So an equivalent fraction for 2/5 is 4/10, and 4/10 is a lot easier to rewrite than 2/5. You don't need to go and do the long division. So sometimes making your fraction bigger actually makes it easier. And that might be helpful for when you're comparing decimals. If I have 1.25 and I want to compare that to 1/4, I might want to go ahead and change this to a decimal. Now I can divide 4 into 1 and find out what my decimal is that way. I can also find an equivalent fraction by multiplying my denominator by a 25. 4 times 25 is 100. Whatever I do to the denominator, I do to the numerator. And 1 times 25 is 25. So I have 25 hundredths. That as a decimal is 0.25. When you're comparing decimals, you start with the number furthest to the right and you start comparing. 0 is equal to 0, so I don't know anything yet, but 1 is less than 2. So that means 0.125 is less than 0.25. 7/8. This one's a little bit trickier, so we might want to go ahead and do some long division. 7 is not divisible by 8, so I'm going to need to add on my 0, and 8 is going to go into 70 8 times. 8 times 8 is 64. When I subtract, I get 6, and I add on another 0, bring that down. 60 divided by 8 is a 7. 7 times 8 is 56. I subtract, I get a 4, and I get one more 0, and then I'll be able to have no remainder because 8 times 5 is 40. So 7/8 written as a decimal is 0.875. So if I want to compare 0.87 to 0.875, they both have an 8 in the tenths. They both have a 7 in the hundredths, but 0 is less than 5. So 0.87 is less than 0.875, making 0.87 less than 7/8. When you're following order of operations, you need to remember your order of operation order, which is PEMDAS. You also need to remember all of your fraction rules and all of your decimal rules. If I want to simplify 1.4 times the quantity 2 minus a 1.8, PEMDAS says I need to start inside with all the parentheses. 2 minus a 1.8 is a 0.2. Now I need to multiply. If I have a calculator, I can certainly type in 1.4 times a 0.2. If you don't, you'll need to do this by hand. When you're multiplying decimals, ignore the decimals until you're done multiplying. 2 times 4 is 8, and 2 times 1 is 2. This is a 0, so I don't really need to write those down. Then, for every decimal place that's moved in both of the numbers that you've multiplied, so one spot here and one spot here, you'll move in the sum of those spots in your answer. So I have 0, 2, 8 down here. I'm going to need to move in 2 spots, 1, 2. And so my answer is 0.28. If you have a simplify that has a numerator and a denominator, and there's multiple expressions in each, you're going to want to start with one part. I'll start with the fraction top of this fraction here. Simplify that as much as you can, and then move to the other part of the fraction, so that the very last thing that you'll have to do is divide. So let's look at our numerator. If I'm following PEMDAS, I need to deal with parentheses and then exponents. So I'm looking at this 0.9 squared. 0.9 times 0.9 would be an 81, and then I have 2 spots in, so that's going to be 0.81. My new numerator is 5.68 plus a 0.81 divided by 100. Now I'll need to do multiplication and division from left to right. I don't have any multiplication, but I do have division. 0.81 divided by 100 looks like this. 100 can't go into 81, but it can go into 810. It'll be able to go in 8 times with 10 left over. When I add on my 0, 100 times 1 will leave me with no remainder. So 0.81 divided by 100 is 0.0081. Now I'm going to do addition and subtraction left to right. 5.68 plus 0.0081. Line up your decimals and fill in any missing spots with a 0. Then add or subtract if you need to subtract, as usual. My new numerator, after I'm done simplifying, is 5.6881. But I have a denominator, and so now my last thing I'm going to do is divide. I'm going to make some space so we have some room to divide. I have 0.2 that's dividing into 5.6881. I'm going to need to move this decimal so that it looks like a 2. And however many spots I need to move it on the outside to make it a whole number is how many steps I'll need to move it on the inside. 2 goes into 5 twice. That will leave me with 1. Bring down the 6 for a 16. And 2 goes into 16 8 times. I have no piece left there, but I can bring down this 8. 2 goes into 8 4 times. Again, no remainder. 1 more 8. And there will be 4 more times. And then I would bring down this 1. 2 doesn't go into 1, so I'm going to need to put in a placeholder and add on 1 more 0. 2 does go into 10 5 times with no remainder. And so my final answer for my simplify is 28 and 4,405 10,000ths. You may also have to do some simplifying after you substitute in values. I have a exponent and I have parentheses in this one. So let's start with our parentheses. 2.2 plus a 3.1 would be 5.3. Now I'm going to need to square that negative 2.3. A negative times a negative is a positive, and 2.3 squared is 5.29. So 5.29 will come in, and the negative 2.3 squared will drop out. Now that my parentheses or exponents are done, I'm looking at multiplication and division left to right. So I'll need to multiply 4.1 times 5.3, although we're going to multiply as if it was 41 times 53. 3 times 1, 3 times 4. 5 times 1, 5 times 4. Add. And then I have 2 spots that are moved in, so I'll move in 2 spots here. The product is 21.73, and my last step will be to add the 5.29. 5.29 plus 21.73 is 27 and 2/100ths. Let's look at the substitutions. If I have a negative 3x plus 4, but I want to let x be equal to 3.7, anywhere I see an x, I can take that out and put the 3.7 in. And then I'll just follow PEMDAS. Negative 3 times the 3.7 is negative 11.1. Then you can do addition and subtraction left to right. When I add 4, I get a negative 7.1. If I was going to let x be a negative 2, y be a 0.5, and z be a 3.6, and I'm going to use the expression x over y, x divided by y, plus 2 times z. I'm going to take the x out. I'll take the y out. Plus 2 times z, but z is 3.6. Fractions are really division problems. And this is really a multiplication problem. So I don't really have any exponents or parentheses. What I really have is multiplication and division from left to right. 0.5 goes into a negative 2 how many times? Let's ignore the negative for a minute. The 0.5 will need to be turned into a 5. I need to have that as a whole number out there, which means this 2 is going to actually turn into a 20. And I'm just going to leave that negative sign off for a minute. 5 goes into 20 4 times with no remainder. So this quotient is a 4, but a negative divided by a positive is a negative. So it's a negative 4. Now I can take care of my multiplication. 3.6 times 2 is 7.2. Now that multiplication and division are done, I can do addition and subtraction left to right. When you're adding numbers that have opposite signs, you find the difference between the two numbers. And then take the sign of the number that has a higher absolute value. 7.2 has a higher absolute value than the -4. So my final answer is a positive 3.2.